In 1700, at a Hopi pueblo called Awatovi, a settlement that had endured centuries was destroyed during violent internal conflict. Survivors were dispersed. That is where this list begins. Awatovi is in Arizona, and it is far from the strangest ancient place preserved across the state. That place makes this list. So do 10 others. There is a 100-room settlement scattered across a desert mesa, a pueblo, near Flagstaff, where scarlet macaws and a copper bell arrived, through long-distance trade, and a 600-room complex, whose preservation was complicated by reconstruction meant to save it. Stay to the end, because number 1 is a village of 154 rooms fitted beneath one sandstone alcove, preserved closely enough that casual self-guided access is prohibited. This channel follows overlooked places, forgotten landscapes, and the real stories left behind, so subscribe if that is your kind of rabbit hole. Today we are counting down 11 ancient ruins hidden in Arizona that shouldn't exist. Number 11, Sears-Kay Ruin, the fortress above the desert. North of Scottsdale and Carefree, a rocky Sonoran desert ridge rises above cactus-covered foothills in Tonto National Forest. On top are the foundations of roughly 40 masonry rooms, arranged in 5 building complexes. The community was established around AD 1050 and abandoned near AD 1200. Archaeologists associate it with the Hohokam tradition. Rather than building on easier low ground, the residents placed substantial masonry on a naturally defensible hilltop overlooking the desert. As many as 100 people may have lived there. That is the signature detail. Around 40 stone rooms, and perhaps 100 residents concentrated on a ridge that now feels almost empty. The name is much newer. It comes from the Sears-Kay Ranch, established in 1887. The ruin entered the National Register of Historic Places in 1995. Today, a developed trail climbs from the parking area to stabilized masonry remains. Wind moves across the walls. Birds replace voices. Distant road noise fades below. The place does not feel impossible because it is enormous. It feels strange because somebody once decided this exposed ridge was home. Number 10, Shoofly Village Ruin, the 4-acre village in the Pines. Near Payson, in the cooler country around the Mogollon Rim, low cobble and stone walls spread through pine and juniper. At first they can look modest. The numbers change that. Shoofly was occupied from about AD 1000 until roughly AD 1280. Archaeologists identify around 87 rooms, with courtyards and a surrounding wall enclosing about 4 acres. This was not a single household in the forest. It was a substantial community. Architectural and ceramic evidence connects Shoofly to the broader prehistoric sequence around Payson, with ties extending toward Hohokam and later Salado-related communities. Over generations, families added rooms and shared spaces. Then occupation ended in the late 13th century. The signature detail is the scale hiding in plain sight. 87 rooms inside a roughly 4-acre compound. Modern interpretation came much later. The site was developed for public visitation in 1994 and is listed on the National Register. Today there is parking, signage, and an interpretive trail through stabilized remains. Shoofly is quiet enough that it takes a moment to understand what you are looking at. Then the room outlines keep going. Number 9. Skay Dagishmu, Val Vaaki, the ancient city under modern Mesa. This one is surrounded by modern streets. In the Salt River Valley, inside a metropolitan landscape, a major earthen platform mound survives from an ancestral Owadam community. Archaeologists historically classified the broader tradition as Hohokam. The principal structures date roughly from AD 1100 to 1400. Long before Mesa had a street grid, desert farmers engineered extensive canals along the Salt River. Those canals supported large areas of farmland. Within that productive landscape, major platform mound communities developed as social, ceremonial, and political centers. Sitejaj Muval Vaaki was among the largest and most important. Then the surrounding landscape changed twice. First, the ancient community ceased using the mound as it once had. Much later, modern development consumed much of the archaeological world around it. By 1987, when the city of Mesa acquired the mound, Archaeology Southwest described it as one of only 2 intact platform mounds remaining from a landscape that had once contained dozens. That is the signature detail. The ruin is not simply an old mound. It is an ancient monumental structure stranded inside a modern city. One survivor from a field of monuments that largely disappeared. The city of Mesa later adopted the Owadham name Sears-Kay Val Vakaki to reflect that indigenous heritage. Today, the Arizona Museum of Natural History oversees the archaeological park, with seasonal public access during the cooler part of the year. Traffic continues outside. The mound stayed put. The world around it did not. Number 8. Elden Pueblo, also known as Pasivi, the pueblo that traded with Mexico. Near Flagstaff, in ponderosa pine and volcanic country beneath the San Francisco peaks, the surviving foundations look like a local story. The artifacts say otherwise. Elden was occupied from about AD 1070 until around AD 1275. It eventually grew to roughly 65 rooms, with some construction reaching 2 stories. By about AD 1150, it had become an important regional trade center. That trade reached well beyond northern Arizona. Archaeologists recovered marine shell, turquoise, pigments, a copper bell, and evidence of scarlet macaws. The materials point toward exchange networks, extending hundreds of miles and reaching toward Mesoamerica. Here's what makes this different. The walls are fixed in one place, but the objects found among them map a much larger world. The signature detail is hard to improve on. Scarlet macaws and a copper bell reach this high desert pueblo through long-distance networks. The community developed during a period when the eruption of Sunset Crater and later climatic shifts were changing settlement patterns around Flagstaff. By the late 13th century, environmental and social pressures contributed to population movement away from the area. Cultural connections did not vanish with the buildings. Federal research links the site to Hopi ancestors and broader regional relationships. J. Walter Fuchs excavated parts of Elden in 1926 and recovered thousands of artifacts. Today, it is maintained as a public heritage and educational archaeology site. A low wall can look local. Evidence of a scarlet macaw changes the map. Number 7. Homolovi 2, the Pueblo looters nearly erased. Near Winslow, the Little Colorado River country opens into broad, treeless high desert. The archaeological remains spread so widely that their full scale is difficult to understand from ground level. Arizona State Parks estimates Homolovi 2 at somewhere between 1,200 and 2,000 rooms. Most activity there occurred during the 14th century. It was part of a dense cultural landscape along the Little Colorado River, and these ancestral places remain significant to Hopi people, who continue cultural connections and pilgrimages to the area. The modern damage came much later. As outsiders collected pottery and other archaeological material, looting intensified through the 20th century. What began as people taking objects from the surface became something far more destructive. Burials, architecture, and ceremonial spaces were damaged in the search for artifacts. Here's the detail that stops people cold. State Historical Material records an episode in which a backhoe was used at Homolovi 2, tearing into archaeological deposits, burials, and kivas. A backhoe. That is the signature detail because it changes the scale of the loss. This was not only somebody pocketing a potsherd. Heavy machinery entered an ancestral pueblo and treated the ground itself as something to be mined. The destruction became one of the central reasons for creating Homolovi State Park. Protection was not simply about preserving attractive ruins. It was about stopping the physical dismantling of an ancestral landscape. Research continued in cooperation with Hopi communities, shifting the site's modern story away from extraction and toward stewardship. Today, Homolovi 2 is protected within the state park. A developed trail lets visitors see part of the pueblo, and archaeological materials are expected to remain where they are found. The high desert still looks open enough to contain almost nothing. Underfoot is evidence of a community measured in well over 1,000 rooms. What survived here did so despite a period when people were willing to tear the past apart to own a piece of it. Number 6. Besh-Ba-Gowah, the ruin that helped define a culture. In Globe, surrounded by the rugged terrain of central Arizona, stone and adobe rooms appear inside the modern town, rather than at the end of a wilderness road. The main occupation dates from roughly AD 1225 to somewhere around AD 1400 or 1450. The pueblo developed around communal spaces during the 13th and 14th centuries. Then, in the 1930s, large-scale excavation changed the site's second life. Depression-era relief programs supported work that exposed substantial parts of the pueblo. Archaeologists recovered pottery and other materials important enough that Besh-Ba-Gowah became foundational to how 20th century scholars defined what they called the Salado archaeological tradition. That is its signature detail. A relatively obscure municipal ruin helped scholars organize an entire regional archaeological pattern. Some of the architecture was reconstructed after excavation. That gives the site an unusual visual character today. Ancient fabric, excavated foundations, and 20th century preservation work occupy the same space. Even the name carries another layer. Local sources trace Besh-Ba-Gowah to an Apache term historically applied to the Globe area, translated as place of metal. Today, the city of Globe maintains the site as an archaeological park and museum, with stabilized and reconstructed sections open to visitors. It is easy to think archaeological categories arrive neatly from textbooks. Sometimes they begin with dirt, pottery, and workers exposing one room after another in a town people drive through every day. Number 5. Pueblo La Plata, the 100-room village above the desert. Agua Fria National Monument protects high desert grassland broken by volcanic mesas and steep canyons. More than 450 prehistoric sites have been recorded across that landscape. Pueblo La Plata is only one of them. The main pueblo contains roughly 80 to 100 masonry rooms and was occupied approximately from AD 1200 or 1250 until around AD 1450. Archaeologists place it within the broader Perry Mesa tradition. The central room block is only part of the story. Agricultural terraces and other features show that people were modifying and working the surrounding landscape, not simply living inside a compact stone village. Arizona State University research recorded about 85 rooms in the pueblo and roughly another 85 isolated structures in the surrounding study area. That is the signature detail. The obvious 80-plus room ruin may represent only half of what the local settlement pattern looks like on a map. Between the 13th and 15th centuries, communities across Perry Mesa concentrated into masonry pueblos. Permanent village occupation later ended, and researchers continue to investigate why the wider landscape was depopulated. Today, Pueblo La Plata remains publicly accessible within the national monument. Reaching it involves unpaved roads, and the Bureau of Land Management recommends high-clearance vehicles for portions of the route. Infrastructure is limited. Cell service is limited. A short trail leads from the parking area, and visitors are expected to leave archaeological material exactly where it lies. The ruin is not isolated from history. It is isolated from convenience. We opened this video with Awatovi, where a centuries-old Hopi pueblo was destroyed in 1700. Let me know in the comments which place so far has changed your picture of ancient Arizona the most. If you are enjoying the deep dive, a thumbs up helps more people find these stories, and the final 4 become much harder to dismiss as simple piles of stone. Number 4. Kinishba Ruins, the 600-room city almost forgotten. In the high country near Fort Apache, on White Mountain Apache tribal lands, large masonry room blocks rise above lower foundations with open country beyond them. The scale is the first surprise. Satoshi Nakamoto contained at least 600 rooms. Construction included multiple levels of sandstone and mortar, supported in places by large wooden roof timbers. Occupation began around AD 1150 and continued until the settlement was abandoned during the 15th century. Over generations, people had aggregated into a very large community in the Upper Salt River region. Archaeological and descendant community evidence connects the place with ancestors of present-day Hopi and Zuni communities. Then Kinishba acquired a second complicated history. Beginning in the 1930s, archaeologist Byron Cummings led major excavation and reconstruction there, working with local Apache laborers. The project exposed and rebuilt large portions of the pueblo. At the time, reconstruction was intended to preserve the architecture and make the scale legible. Some of those early methods later created preservation problems of their own. That means modern conservators have had to deal with two different kinds of aging material: the ancient structures and parts of the 20th century work that was supposed to protect them. The signature detail remains the sheer size. At least 600 rooms once stood here, making Kinishba one of the largest ancestral pueblos in the region, while it remains far less famous than southwestern sites of comparable scale. Today, the ruin remains on White Mountain Apache tribal lands. Current guidance from the Fort Apache Heritage Foundation directs visitors to check in at Besh-Ba-Gowah Museum for permits and current information before going to the site. Kinishba survived abandonment. Then, it had to survive archaeology. That is a quieter kind of irony, but an important one. Preserving the past is sometimes a process of learning how earlier generations tried to preserve it. Number 3. Devil's Chasm Ruin, the village built where almost nobody could reach it. The Sierra Ancha landscape in Gila County is deep canyon country. Sheer cliffs, oak and juniper, broken rock, steep drainages, and routes that do not reward casual mistakes. Somewhere within that archaeological landscape, substantial masonry survives against a protected cliff recess. Devil's Chasm is not a developed archaeological park. Reaching the area involves rough vehicle access followed by a steep, physically demanding backcountry route. Exact location details are deliberately not part of this story because the site is fragile. Its remoteness is not merely a modern inconvenience. It is part of the archaeological question. Late prehistoric communities in the Sierra Ancha constructed substantial buildings in terrain that is difficult, even with modern roads and equipment. Archaeologists have debated how these settlements relate to Salado, Mogollon, Kayenta, and local traditions. The cultural labels have shifted as the evidence has been reconsidered. Formal investigation has a long history. Emil Hari and other archaeologists recorded Sierra Ancha cliff dwellings during work in 1929 and 1930. Later research by Richard Lang returned to questions of architecture and settlement history. So the site has been studied for nearly a century, yet it remains obscure compared with Arizona's developed national monuments. The signature detail is not a room count or a single artifact. It is the survival of substantial masonry in terrain so steep and inaccessible that the journey becomes part of the archaeological story. Isolation creates problems for researchers. It also helped protect architecture that might have been easier to dismantle, loot, or simply wear down if a road had ended beside it. Today, substantial remains survive, but there is no assumption of visitor infrastructure. Current land manager guidance matters, and the structures are fragile cultural resources, not climbing features. Some ruins survive because walls are rebuilt around them. This one survived partly because getting there was never easy. Number 2. Awatovi Ruins, the pueblo destroyed from within. In 1540, Spanish members of the Coronado expedition reached Hopi country and encountered Awatovi. The settlement was already more than 3 centuries old. It became the first Hopi settlement encountered by that expedition. The Spanish presence deepened over time. In 1629, Franciscan missionaries established San Bernardo de Aguatubi at Awatovi. For decades, the pueblo existed within growing colonial pressure, missionary activity, and the political realities affecting pueblo communities across the Southwest. Then came 1680. Awatovi participated in the Pueblo Revolt, the broad uprising that expelled Spanish colonial authorities and missionaries from Pueblo communities for more than a decade. Missionary control ended for a time. It did not end permanently. When Spanish missionary efforts returned, divisions inside and between Hopi communities sharpened. In 1700, attackers from other Hopi villages destroyed Awatovi. Survivors were dispersed among other communities. The event is documented, but it is not a simple story of villains and victims, arranged neatly for modern audiences. It involved political, religious, colonial, and community tensions inside a world that had already endured more than a century and a half of Spanish intrusion. That complexity matters. Centuries later, Harvard's Peabody Museum expedition excavated Awatovi during the 1930s. The scale they documented was enormous. Portions of more than 1,300 rooms, 3 Franciscan church structures, and an artifact assemblage that included more than 500,000 pottery sherds. That is the signature detail. More than 1,300 rooms and over 500,000 pottery fragments sat beneath a place whose final chapter had already become one of the most consequential episodes in Hopi history. Today, Awatovi remains on the Hopi reservation and is designated a National Historic Landmark. It is not open to the public. There is no casual drive-up visit and no self-guided walk through the ruins. The closure fits the story better than a viewing platform would. Awatovi is not an abandoned stage set waiting for outsiders to complete it. It is an ancestral Hopi place, with a history that never became simple just because the buildings fell quiet. Number 1. Keet Seel, also known as Kawestima, the city inside the cliff. The canyon walls rise in bands of red and tan sandstone. Wind moves through narrow side canyons and then disappears beneath a vast overhang. Footsteps carry farther than expected in the acoustic emptiness. At the back of the alcove, masonry walls seem to occupy the rock rather than stand apart from it. The scale takes time to register. Keet Seel contains approximately 154 rooms used for living, storage, and ceremonial purposes, all fitted into one enormous natural sandstone shelter. The overhang helped protect walls, wooden elements, and other architecture from the weather with unusual effectiveness. The principal cliff-dwelling construction belongs largely to the 13th century. Tree ring research places occupation firmly in the mid to late 1200s, with evidence by at least AD 1274. Hundreds of tree ring samples have made Keet Seel one of the more precisely dated ancestral pueblo sites in the region. Ancestral pueblo families had used the wider Tsesegi Canyon landscape before the village reached this form. During the 13th century, they built densely inside the irregular alcove, fitting rooms and storage spaces into the contours of the shelter rather than forcing the landscape into a simple grid. Around AD 1300, physical occupation of the cliff settlements ended. The people did not simply vanish. Descendant histories continue among Hopi and other Pueblo communities. That distinction matters because Keet Seel is preserved so well that it can encourage the wrong kind of fantasy. There is no need for a lost civilization or impossible engineering. Its survival has understandable causes: architecture, climate, isolation, and the enormous sandstone roof above it. In 1909, President William Howard Taft established Navajo National Monument, in large part to protect Keet Seel and neighboring cliff dwellings. More than a century later, protection still shapes how the site is experienced. As of August 2026, physical access remains limited to special National Park Service guided trips. Visits are strenuous, controlled, and subject to participant limits and overnight requirements. Unsupervised visitation is prohibited. That brings us back to the signature detail. There are 154 rooms beneath a single sandstone alcove, and substantial portions remain close enough to their original condition that modern access is deliberately restricted rather than converted into ordinary walk-through tourism. The walls are still there. The shelter is still doing the job it has done for centuries. The canyon still keeps its distance, and after 11 entries, that may be the most striking thing Arizona's ancient ruins have in common. They survived because people built carefully, because landscapes protected them, because descendants remembered them, or because somebody eventually decided that taking one more piece was not worth what would be lost. Keet Seel leaves the clearest image of all: a village held inside stone, visible across the silence, but never entirely ours to enter. There are many more ancestral sites, settlement landscapes, and half-forgotten ruins across Arizona that could fill another list. My favorite is Keet Seel, because its preservation makes the distance between the 13th century and the present feel unusually small. Which entry surprised you most, and which Arizona site should have made the list? Subscribe for more overlooked places and the stories still attached to them.